Good morning, everyone. It's 10 a.m., so let us begin. My name is Veena Najibola. I'm the Vice President of Research and Strategy here at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and it is such a pleasure to welcome you all to another APFC event, this one focused on the shifting geopolitical dynamics in the Canadian Arctic and partnerships with the North Pacific. I must confess, when we planned for this workshop, we didn't know that the questions around Arctic security and geopolitics would be so incredibly topical and headline news, but we're very happy to be able to convene this conversation now. It's on the record. We obviously have all of you here with us in the room, but also it's being live streamed to an audience who's joining us across Canada, and we will use the recording of this to further promote the conversation. Let me also acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And here at APFC, we are devoted to the work of reconciliation, especially when it comes to conversations about Canadian North and Arctic territories. So, and we're very happy to have representatives of the Indigenous community here with us, especially Chief Ruth Macy. Welcome. Thank you for joining us and traveling from Yukon to be here. I'm also delighted to see so many folks who made the trip from Ottawa and other parts of Canada to be part of a workshop that we convened on this topic all day yesterday. So this public conversation is essentially translation and some highlights from a discussion that we were able to convene all day yesterday with representatives from Canada, the United States, South Korea, as well as France, the UK, Mongolia, a number of others, and representatives from the Department of National Defense and other Global Affairs Canada and other parts of Canadian government. This whole initiative is generously supported by the Department of National Defense, and we're very grateful for that. It's part of creating conversations that expand our understanding of the Arctic. So much of the Arctic conversation has been very Euro-Atlantic focused, which is understandable and rightly so. We have now all of northeastern Arctic countries in NATO, with the exception of Russia, so it makes sense that both NORAD and NATO historically have really anchored our understanding, particularly of security dynamics in the Arctic. But I think increasingly over the last few years, we also are noticing that countries like Japan and South Korea in particular, but also India, Singapore, and other observer states in the Arctic Council have their own strategies on engagement with this important region and want to be part of the conversation. And as we've noted in a number of Canadian documents, like the Indo-Pacific Strategy, like the Arctic Foreign Policy that was released last year, like in our defense documents, there is a recognition that we can do more with those North Pacific partners, especially when it comes to issues of science cooperations, when it comes to technological cooperation. Japan and South Korea in particular bring a lot to the table. They're both also manufacturing superpowers when it comes to shipbuilding. Korea is also building icebreakers, which will be quite something by 2030, but already obviously have icebreakers even now. So I think there's that recognition, but of course so that's the opportunity side, which I think we can speak about on technology, on science, but there's also growing perceptions that there are emerging in a North Pacific part that kind of gets ignored, particularly around Alaska, sort of the North Pacific as a gateway to Arctic, especially since 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think the dynamics between Russia and China have really changed, and China can now use Russia much more for its ambitions in the region. But we do also need to fully understand what those threats are, because I think especially in the current environment, it's easy to exaggerate them and to sort of feel like, Russia and China are encircling Greenland or basically building camp in the north. And I think we need to have an evidence-based conversation rather one that's built around rhetoric that is particularly being politicized, I think, right now in Greenland. So it was really a timely conversation. That is basically the sort of the objectives of what we're trying to do. It's one of a series of discussions. We want to also continue to have them in parts of Canada. So we've had a conversation around this in Ottawa, in Whitehorse, now here in Vancouver, and want to continue to engage, especially also with the public, because there is now growing interest in this. I also have to note that all of this is happening at a moment of tremendous flux and change. Some of you may have heard our Prime Minister just deliver what, in my view, is one of the most consequential speeches of a Canadian leader on foreign policy. He delivered it at Davos just 2 hours ago, and I definitely encourage you to listen to it. It was powerful, it was brave, and it was unusual in its nuance and sophistication of both examining the moment that we're in terms of the changes that are unfolding, and also what will be required of countries like Canada that are not great powers, that are not US or China, to both recognize the predicament that we're in, so to not be naive about the tremendous challenge that we feel, the crisis that the pressure that we feel, but also to be then courageous in a couple of things. In strategic clarity, so he said we need to stop living the lie and start living the truth. The lie that the rules-based order still exists, the lie that rules can protect us, the lie that integration can actually help us with stability and security, and that we need to start living the truth, that we have to start investing in ourselves and building more pragmatic partnerships, including with countries like China with the right guardrails, and that also our approach to our most important partner, the US, has to change. So he delivered the speech. We'll see how that will translate into actions, but I do want to recognize that that's part of the change. So our foreign policy writ large is changing. The way we're building relationships are changing. So this is a timely discussion. We have 4 exceptional experts on the panel here with me, and we have many more in the room who've participated in yesterday's discussion and who are also joining us for the first time today. So I do hope that this will be conversation. That's why I'm not standing at a podium. This will be conversation here for the first 20 minutes or so, and then we will definitely invite everybody in the room to join in. So as I mentioned, we have Dr. Elizabeth Wishnik from Columbia University. We have Dr. San-Ho Kang from Korea Polar Research Institute joining us from Korea. We have Dr. Jennifer Spence from Harvard University Arctic Initiative joining us from the US, and Dr. Natsuko Atsuka from Japan Sasakawa Peace Foundation. They all have extremely impressive bios and have been working or dealing with the issues of Arctic and the North for multiple decades. I thought that I will actually ask them each to self-introduce briefly, to kind of say what brings, who they are, their institution, and how they're approaching this conversation, and then I'll start with the questions. So Jennifer, why don't we start with you?
Do you have to turn this on? Yes. Good morning, everyone. There we go. All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for hosting this event. As you said, it's hard to imagine a more timely conversation to be part of right now, but also extremely difficult in the sense that, as I joked yesterday, I often, when I speak, feel I have to refresh my social media feed before I speak because something could have happened in the 5 minutes since I last checked. So this is a very dynamic environment. I am the director of the Arctic Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School. I come there, our focus very much is on governance and sustainable development in the Arctic. We have sort of read the room, for lack of a better term, and have moved more into the geopolitics and security space, but really with the motivation being around how to support good governance in the region. I come from working for the Arctic Council, for the Sustainable Development Working Group. I was the executive secretary. So for me, it's that space between research and policymaking that is so incredibly important right now. And my last sort of comment, well, I work in the United States. I am a Canadian, and my family happily lives in Ottawa, so.
We welcome Americans here as
yes,
well. So
absolutely, but.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for giving an opportunity to join this very interesting and important occasion. My name is Natsuhiko Otsuka from Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Tokyo, Japan, and my background is engineering, dealing with the port and ocean, and focusing on the ice-covered waters. So before joining the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, I was a professor of the Hokkaido University Arctic Research Center, and focusing on my research topic is focusing on the Arctic shipping. But my final last few years of my university career, I tried to tackle with to integrate the many academic knowledge to deal with the real social issues. And now Sasakawa Peace Foundation is dealing with the supporting the Japanese government to establish the new Arctic policy at this moment. And this is a great opportunity for us to have exchange of many ideas. So I was really interested in this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Liz Wishnick from New York City, which some people think is in the United States. I am a senior research scholar at Columbia's Weatherhead East Asian Institute. And my research for many years has focused on China-Russia relations. And I've looked at the topic from both points of view, and I spent a lot of time in Eastern Russia and also in Northeastern China. And so my study of the Arctic came from that point of view, looking at how their cooperation in the Arctic has developed. I also led a project for the East-West Center on U.S. Indo-Pacific partners in the Arctic, looking at the roles of Japan, South Korea, India, and Singapore, and that's how I first became acquainted with this research institution, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to continue the conversation.
Hello, my name is Song-Ho Kang. I'm from Korea Polar Research Institute. I'm now serve as a principal research scientist. I'm actually polar oceanographer. I started my study from Antarctica since 1987. I have participated in Arctic and Antarctic more than 36 times. So I try to talk about my opinion as an oceanographer. So this is very important opportunity to give my perspective to here. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Kang, for being here, and also for your experience, your practical on-the-ground, well, on-ice experience in the Arctic and South Pole. You mentioned that you've been there 36 times, so I think we will very much be bringing that perspective of a scientist, where we're lucky to have a political scientist as well as scientist and engineer on this panel to make sense of the various dimensions of the Arctic. And also for our Korea and Japan colleagues, the very much is on the science and technology and the shipbuilding components. So I'll begin maybe by inviting both Liz and Jennifer to actually start with the broader geopolitical and security context. And particularly, Jennifer, if you could begin by explaining how the strategic and security environment in the Arctic has been shifting over the last, let's say, 3 to 5 years. And then also what is happening currently and how you're understanding the threats and challenges currently to both in the Pacific but also your Atlantic part of the Arctic.
Yeah, thank you.
Big question.
Yeah, nice small question, and really easy to answer in a short period of time. So I think hindsight is always something that we can look back on history and or current events and see things that we didn't see at the time. And so I would say that although we have sort of talked about Arctic exceptionalism for quite some time as a place where we were sort of protected from some of the other geopolitical challenges that were taking place, that we really started to see some tensions start with the invasion of Crimea. in 2014. Now they were small. They were things that generated tensions between the collaboration. But really, the Arctic continued to be what we framed as an area of peace and cooperation. That fundamentally shifted with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But there were already, ironically, and we don't talk about this as much, the impacts of COVID-19 in 2020 was also a challenge to cooperation and diplomacy, because ultimately we didn't have those relationships. And so we're actually looking at 6 years now of challenged diplomacy because people haven't been able to sustain relationships in a really important way. And then ultimately what we've seen, I would say, is, I mean, there's different opinions on this, but there has been an effort, a sustained effort by all 8 Arctic states, sort of after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to try to sustain some of that cooperation. I would call this science diplomacy, and that has been, there has been efforts to do that. There is work happening in the Arctic Council. It's very much at the working level between researchers, experts, and scientists. It's not a political engagement, but it is keeping the lines of communication open in important ways. As I mentioned yesterday, I've been part of a group specifically looking at the future of Arctic research cooperation and diplomacy as part of a larger research planning activity. So over the last 2 years, bringing together experts to talk about how we better understand the dynamics. And I think one of the things that we made a decision is to acknowledge is that these geopolitical shifts were not just around the relationship with Russia, which is half of the Arctic, but also other things. And that was quite timely, as we now see with the second Trump administration, another sort of shock to the Arctic system. And in some ways where the Russian sort of dynamics were predictable and sort of happened over an extended period of time, there was a trajectory, there was a type of relationship. This shock, I think, is much more substantial in terms of transforming how we think and imagine the Arctic. And it's such a moment of flux and uncertainty and instability that I don't know that we can actually anticipate where this is going. I think the Carney's speech provides some signals. Europe's reaction to the Trump administration's comments around Greenland and desire to annex Greenland give you some sense of the direction we may be going. But ultimately, this is real time. We really are sort of only imagining what this might look like.
It's hit refresh, but also try to actually co-create the reality that is emerging, right? So not just reacting to it, but also being part of the conversations. I think Prime Minister Carney again reminded everybody in Davos that as middle powers, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So the idea that, yes, great powers are really flexing their muscle right now, but middle powers also have something that they can bring and have power in different ways, including by convening conversations among the small groups. Yeah.
And I think that's what makes the Arctic so interesting, because you have Russia and China in the Arctic, but then you have the other 6 Arctic states, which you could deem to be middle powers, especially in the Arctic context, that these are countries that have worked in that space of middle power and what that means.
Exactly, that was exactly what he was mentioning. Liz, if I could bring you into the conversation, especially sort of to speak a little bit from how we are understanding the threats in the Arctic and sort of this China-Russia convergence, to what extent that is real, to what extent there's still a lot of deficit in strategic trust between those two, and how that's seen both in the kind of the Pacific side by other actors like Korea and Japan, but also what does that mean for Canada and the Euro-Atlantic partnership? So again, small question, but I'll see where you go with it.
Very small questions. So I would start even earlier than the Russian invasion of Crimea with the changes that impact the Arctic. I would start with 2008 and the global economic crisis. Because after that point, you see Russia and China turning more to one another to create alternatives to what they saw as a failed model of global economic governance. And you also saw Iceland at that time becoming more interested in cooperating with China. And then just prior to the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, you had the first Chinese upstream investments in Russian energy in the Russian Arctic. And Russia had been hesitant for many years to allow that. Russia was one of the countries that was, with Canada, that was most reserved about China joining the Arctic Council as an observer state. And so you see a change after 2014, as we just heard. And after 2022, that's when you really saw a deepening of China-Russia relations as China became the key supporter for Russia in the war on Ukraine, stopping just short of providing direct lethal aid, but providing just about everything else. And for Russia, this has meant that there have been few other options in terms of investment in the Arctic as other countries have withdrawn largely. And so China has become important not just as an investor, but as a provider of technology. And so this also relates to another big change that we've seen in the past decade, and that's China's emergence as a big technology developer. And so you had the Made in China 2025 policy coming out in 2015, and China's policymakers becoming focused on developing the new strategic frontiers, as they call them, which are the polar regions, also deep sea and space technologies, as well as cyber, all technologies that will become very important in the Arctic region. So China is trying to emerge as this high-tech power, and that puts it in the crosshairs of Western countries that are also very strong in technology. And so as the climate crisis also accelerates and we look for these green technologies to address it, China becomes a key player, but also undermines other European and other actors in this sphere. And so then you have the emergence of critical minerals as a topic in tensions between China and the rest of the world, as China has been seen to weaponize supply chains beginning in 2010 with Japan, and you have the US under the first Trump administration imposing tariffs, so you have kind of weaponization of trade that occurs on both sides, and leaving us in a situation where the Arctic becomes a new arena for competition, not just because of geopolitics, but because of these minerals which are found there in abundance, but are hard to process and very highly prized for all of the semiconductors that power our many devices, as well as military technologies. So after 2022, you see this deepening Russia-China military cooperation emerge, and you see that in the Arctic region, particularly in the North Pacific Arctic. That's really the focal point. There's a lot of attention to Russian and Chinese boats allegedly circling Greenland, but that's not where they're actually sailing. They're mostly in the Bering Sea, and you've seen cooperation between the Chinese and Russian Coast Guards and their militaries doing various kinds of exercises in this particular region. And that's because China is the most important user of the Northern Sea route, the Arctic waterway above the Russian Arctic. And so for China, it's a strategic passageway, and Russia needs China's help in developing it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Liz. For trying to capture a lot in that very short answer, and for reminding us that there are sort of three elements that are converging and are shaping the situation in the Arctic, both the geopolitical competition, but also technological innovations that are really changing what we can do up there, as well as obviously the climate change dynamics, which are also linked to exploration of critical minerals like critical, energy resources in general, both for clean as well as conventional, and then of course shipping routes and the commercial opportunities. So, and I do want to come back to some of what you said towards the end on what Russia and China are actually doing together in the North Pacific, particularly through joint naval exercises, Coast Guard cooperation since 2024, and kind of especially now, right? There's a market shift and change. But before I do that, I want to bring in colleagues from Sasakawa Peace Foundation to speak a little bit about how Japan sees the Arctic more generally from a kind of a position of its overall oceans policy and free and open Indo-Pacific as part of it, but more globally, and how that position is changing over the last 10 years, because Japan has had an Arctic policy for now 10 years, and we're now seeing some rethinking of that. So I'd love to hear what that rethinking is about, but also opportunities then for cooperation potentially with countries like Canada around science, but also around shipbuilding, technology, maritime domain awareness, and all of that. So again, a broad set of questions. You can choose which part of it you want to focus on. I'm giving you choices. This is an empowered panel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So, can you hear me? No? Oh, okay, okay. So, partly I'd like to start about the climate change, environmental change in the Arctic, how those change affects the mid-latitude area like Japan and Korea. Then I would like to touch upon the human activity or utilization of the Arctic Ocean from our side. So so as you may know, in the Arctic region is as you may see that the geopolitical relations are undergoing significant shifts, involving Arctic nations and also involving in the Asian nations like Japan and Korea as well. And as you may know that the rapid warming and environmental changes in the Arctic are now beginning to expand to the mid-latitude area. For example, Japan, based on the Arctic change, we are experiencing the extreme climate event like heavy rain, or heat wave, or cold wave, and also we are experiencing environmental change on the marine ecosystems. For example, in Japan, the salmon catch is drastically decreasing. This last year, maybe 1/5 of the catch. So this is because of the change of the ocean condition, mainly in the Okhotsk Sea and the Bering Sea area. And we are realizing the biodiversity change in not only in the Bering area, but also the Okhotsk Sea along the Japan's northern coast. So in parallel with that, another new species like warm water fish species are coming into the northern part of Japan. So the species are changing, fishing ground are changing as well. And so, and focus on the shipping activities along the Arctic. So Northern Sea route shipping volume are recovering from the temporary decline due to the economic sanctions against Russia because of Russian oil and natural gas exports and general cargo transport between China and Russia is continuing and increasing. And so, the shipping activities along the Northern Sea route remains at this moment. Also, to focus in the Northwest Passage area, the cruise activities are drastically increasing after the COVID-19. And due to the long-term sea ice retreat in the Arctic, this tendency will be continued. So the Arctic shipping along the Northern Sea route will be continued by Russia and China, and also the cruise activities are continued and will be increased along the Northwest Passage. And also in the future, more offshore shipping route will become a reality, including the Central Arctic Ocean area. Also in the Central Arctic Ocean area, particularly in the Chukchi Sea, and also northern part of the North Pacific area, will become one of the fishing ground for commercial fisheries. So this Central Arctic Ocean CALFA will be one of the key points for the governance of the shipping activities. But in order to enhance these activities, we need to develop the observation of the shipping activity in that area in order to detect the illegal activities in that area. So in this reason, the satellite observation is a very, very strong tool, will be more very strong tools. And at this moment, yesterday I showed you that we can detect the ship activities very, very precisely by using the synthetic aperture radar and satellite AIS system. However, this SAR radar is observation interval is mainly the 2 weeks by Japanese satellite and the 6 days by the European satellites. And these services are not enough for detecting those illegal activities. So we need to develop something. So one idea is to cooperate to use the several satellite service to detect the certain areas. So and also the technology to develop the detecting ship activities by satellite data is also must be developed to use more effectively. So we have in the technical area, we need to do many things to develop the when we consider the sustainable use of the Arctic Ocean.
Thank you so much. And I think that is a really promising area of deeper cooperation between certainly Canada and Japan, but also potentially in the North Pacific between Canada, Japan, Korea, and the US as well, as we think about like-minded countries together, since there's a lot more activities you mentioned, both for cruises as well as for fishing and commercial routes now happening and will increasingly happen moving forward. We need to have better understanding of what's actually going on there, so being able to have sensors and radars and being able to have satellite imageries, all of the things that I think it would be fair to say Canada has also some capabilities in, and I know there are colleagues in the room from Oceans and Fisheries as well as from D&D who could speak to that as well. But I think in your presentations both yesterday and today, I think the clear message there is that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for partnering, and as we need to have these practical ways that we come together, not just sort of at the strategic level, thinking of North Pacific as a concept of bringing together US, Canada, or certainly Canada, Japan, Korea, maybe US as well. We'll see, but also these practical areas where we can actually cooperate. So Dr. Khan, maybe I'll bring you in on this point as well, because I know you can speak quite a bit to what's actually going on up there, and also to the climate threats, because a lot of time we speak about the potential security, military implications of what's happening up there. But from your perspective, there are some serious climate emergencies that we also need to be mindful of, and I'd love to hear that perspective from you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I come from South Korea. It's non-Arctic country, so we don't have no Arctic jurisdiction. But we have invested in polar science more than 40 years, decades. So the experience has taught us that responsible engagement in the Arctic depends less on speed or ambition and more on evidence, sequencing, and restraint. So from a scientific standpoint, our role is not to decide and what should be done, but to help clarify the limits within which decisions are made. It is now well established that Arctic is warming much faster than the global average, the 4 times faster than our global average. But from an operational and scientific standpoint, the more sequential change is not changing alone. It is increasing variability. Sea ice is thinner, more mobile. Storm patterns are less stable. Ocean conditions are changing in ways that are harder to predict. So as a result, while physical access may increase, predictability does not necessarily improve. So in the Arctic, predictability is not a luxury. It is the minimum condition that allows activity, scientific, commercial, governmental, to occur safely, repeatedly, and responsibly. Much of the infrastructure now being discussed in the Arctic, ports, shipping routes, subsea cables, coastal facilities, was designed for physical environment that was relatively stable. The stability is disappearing. As environmental variability increases, it becomes more difficult to distinguish between environmental damage, operational failure, or external interference. From a scientific perspective, this ambiguity itself becomes a source of risk. It delays decision-making, it complicates response, and it increases the chance that incidents are misinterpreted. Many serious Arctic incidents do not begin as deliberate actions. They begin as misunderstandings of environmental conditions. As Arctic activity increases, science does not argue for speed or delay. It argues for sequence. Data first, operations second, scale last. When this sequence is reversed, risk accumulates faster than resilience. So I'd like to conclude with a simple reflection. The Arctic is not becoming simpler as it warms. It's becoming more dynamic, more variable, harder to predict. Stability in the Arctic, therefore, does not come from moving first, but from understanding when, where, under what conditions it is responsible to move at all. So that shared understanding, grounded evidence, experience, and respect for uncertainty is what allows cooperation function and trust to endure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that is a powerful message that we need to hear, both in terms of how that stability and predictability is changing because of climate change effect and because of human-made activities up there as well, and also sort of the from a science perspective, the need to move not fast and not to be the first one, but rather to move in a way that is sustainable, data-driven, and responsible and operationally safe. But of course, that is the ideal recommendation from a scientist. We live in a less than perfect world in which it seems like that may not be the approach that I think are taken to lots of things that are on the frontier of technology, both in terms of certainly AI, space exploration, and obviously also what we're doing in the Arctic. Jennifer, if I could come to you, because you spend so much of your time kind of trying to bridge the research and the policy world. We've heard 2 really powerful perspectives from our colleagues from Korea and Japan on sort of what's happening from a science and research perspective. How is that informing what you're seeing from a governance and policy-making perspective? Do you see those linkages? Do you see those conversations actually happening? Or there is a greater disconnect now than maybe even 2-3 years ago because of the geopolitical and security pressures that everybody's feeling? I don't know if that question makes sense.
No,
but
no, yeah. What I would say is it's complicated. I think
I'm
what
afraid everything has to
yeah. What I would say is what I've seen and what I have worked towards contributing to is recognizing that at this point, it's not necessarily governments that can lead a lot of these collaborations. And so it is about pragmatism and recognizing the ecosystems of institutions that work in these various spaces and can create those relationships to move issues forward. So policy ultimately is informed at the domestic level, but it's informed by those who provide the research, that provide the advice. And so there's still a huge amount of work that can be done in that space. And I think one of the things that we're spending a lot of time doing right now is actually providing nuance. A lot of what the challenge that we face is that the Arctic is becoming more interesting to people, but the level of understanding that comes with that is not necessarily coming along with it. And so we need to hear from those who have worked in the spaces, and that's not specific to just Arctic people from Arctic states, but from experts from all over the world who bring that expertise to inform good policy making, and to inform those policies that they can, to be quite pragmatic about this. And I do see that progress being made in specific policy areas. But there's still a lot more that, there are definitely challenges to the sort of classic multilateral institutions.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. I think when you say that there's a lot of interest now in the Arctic, I think one of the interests is around understanding the threats in the Arctic. And Liz, I wanted to bring you specifically to this question. What exactly are the threats in the Arctic, certainly maybe from the perspective of US or Canada or even NATO? So and maybe there are differences, so if you could elaborate on that, because in his speech just today, Prime Minister Carney sort of said that the threats in the Arctic are perspective, not actual, and that we intend to keep them that way. So I'd like you to respond to that, and perhaps others as well, whether you agree with that statement, and if yes, then what are those perspective threats, and then or actual if you don't, and how do we intend to keep them that way? So what do we need to do to maintain that stability and resilience?
Another really easy question. So I think that there are short-term and long-term threats, and or immediate and long-term threats. The immediate threat has to do with climate change. I mean, that we are seeing, and it is magnified in the Arctic. And what, as my colleagues mentioned, what happens there impacts not just the Arctic states, but countries well away from them. So we have climate issues, and then we have also to consider that there are multiple Arctics. So there's the Central Arctic Ocean, which is not yet navigable, which is still governed by a treaty to restrict fishing. Then we have the Russian Arctic, and the threat there is that that is the moneymaker for the Russian war economy, which drives the conflict in Ukraine. And so what happens in the Arctic directly impacts what's going on in Ukraine. And because of that war, you saw Sweden and Finland join NATO. You have a heightening of tensions in the Baltic region. So there are some immediate threats that we are facing in that region. And so that spills over into the European Arctic, which is where NATO has been traditionally most focused. And now we have this constructed issue of the supposed threats to Greenland, which add to the mix. And so if we look at Greenland was very important in World War II in terms of the fight against Nazi Germany. It was important in the Cold War as Soviet and American submarines were circling in the waters of what's called the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. And in recent years, it's become, again, a focal point of attention. You have in maybe the last decade, you do see more Russian vessels and submarines in those waters. And after China became an observer state in the Arctic Council, China became interested in investing in Greenland, but was not successful in most investments. Most of the mining projects were abandoned. I think there's one that's still on paper active, but not proceeding. There was one satellite ground station on paper also not proceeding, and that's it. And you had one Chinese icebreaker visit Greenland's waters in 2017 after making a circumpolar voyage through the Northwest Passage. That's the only ship from China. So there's a kind of conflation of what China could do, because China does have a lot of resources that it would be certainly very interested in investing in the Arctic, but exactly because of its support for Russia in Ukraine, there's been a reaction against Chinese involvement, not just in the Arctic, but in Europe in general. And de-risking has been the preferred term in Europe, and an effort to be very cautious about any Chinese investments. Some Arctic investments that China had have been halted in other countries. And the one active project is in Iceland. It's a research station to study the aurora borealis, and most of the others have been terminated or restricted. And then we come to the North Pacific Arctic. Now that's where we should be paying attention, because since 2022, we have seen a lot more Russian and Chinese military activity and Coast Guard activity. We've seen exercises, naval, Coast Guard, strategic air bombers taking off from Anadyr and Russian territory for the first time. We saw a Chinese submarine involved for the first time. So that's been the focal point of their activity, and it's because of the Northern Sea Route that my colleague mentioned, because they need this passage through the Bering Strait to use the Northern Sea Route. And so that's of interest, also fishing resources, and its proximity to the US. They feel a threat from what they perceive as an expanding NATO into Asia, where you have more interactions between NATO and Northeast Asian countries. And so they're countering what they see as a threat by this activity. Also, China's northeastern provinces have been lagging behind economically. They would like to be more involved in the Arctic. And so they're enthusiastic about cooperating with Russia in this area. So if I were to say where to focus my attention on the actual China-Russia threat, it would be the North Pacific Arctic, not the waters of Greenland.
So, yeah, anybody else who wants to weigh in? I know, Jennifer, you want to, but also I'll invite other colleagues. But Jennifer, go ahead.
Yeah, there's the threats, but I would also say there's been a conflation when it comes to opportunities too. And this is one of the things I find somewhat concerning. I mean, we talk about increased shipping in the Arctic. This is still going to be an incredibly difficult place to operate. There's a huge infrastructure deficit. And so I think that we talk about mining opportunities and resources, whether it be fisheries, but all of these sort of are all about potential. These are not there are fisheries in the Arctic, but in terms of new emerging fisheries in the Arctic, these are potential things that there's still a lot of investment that would be necessary to make this. And this is an incredibly environmentally sensitive region where the risks of an oil spill or a natural event of some sort based on increased human activity could be extremely detrimental in a space where we don't have the monitoring and the emergency response necessary. So again, as much as the threats are a component, I also think we need to think very carefully about what we're hearing in terms of opportunities and reflect more carefully on some of the real opportunities and what they are and what that might mean in terms of investment.
That's an interesting point. I know I had promised that I will engage the audience, and I really want to do that because we do have a lot of expertise, and there are many dimensions to this conversation, obviously, especially in the last couple of points, both in terms of the right-sizing the threat and understanding the threats, particularly in the North Pacific, but also in right-sizing the opportunities and the challenges of exploring those opportunities in terms of lack of infrastructure and being sensitive to the climate impact, and also not forgetting we haven't yet brought in the human dimension. For many of us, the Arctic is very far and maybe not very populated, but there are actual human communities that are living there, especially obviously Indigenous and First Nations, but also others. So kind of how do we I think there's a lot of interest now in this dual use and being able to kind of fulfill more than one objective, security, defense, kind of as a narrative to be able to marshal a lot more resources. There's also obviously the civilian infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt, and each country I think is approaching it slightly differently and has different things to bear. So I want us to get into that part of the conversation as well, but I also want to bring in others from the room here to engage with any of the elements, including the ones that I just put on the table, on the kind of the dual use, the infrastructure, the human dimension of all of this, and then also to ask questions or to challenge the conversation. So this is my attempt to open up and see where we go from here. I see two hands bravely up already, so I'll call on you, Jen, first, and May will bring you the microphone. Please wait so that colleagues on live stream can hear. She's right here. No, right. Sorry, we'll get this done.
Hi there, I'm Joanna Chu. I was a journalist based in Beijing and Hong Kong before, and tracking how China positioned itself with the Arctic. And 10 years ago, it seemed like people weren't as accepting of China as an Arctic or near Arctic state, but do you think that Beijing has been successful somewhat in, being seen as a country with a legitimate stake in the Arctic? And also, secondly, could you kind of summarize, I know this has been brought up already, but the critical role of critical minerals in the latest discussions. Do you think it's the top or just one of the main current draws of some of the geopolitical tussles over who gets to be called an Arctic state and who, has access?
Great. Those are great questions, Joanna. Maybe we'll take note of them and then come back so that everybody has a chance. So both on China's status as the near Arctic or more active there, as well as the critical minerals. Yes, please, Patrick. And then I'll come here.
Thank you. Good morning. Patrick Duxbury from the Inuit Development Corporation Association. Question, context. In 2020, the government of Canada blocked the sale of the Hope Bay Gold project. It was an acquisition that was set to occur with the Shandong Gold. And then in 2021, a Canadian company, Agnico Eagle, managed to take over the project, and everyone's happy with that. In light of the rapprochement is maybe too strong a word, but last week recalibration of Canada-China relationships. Do you believe that there may be a slightly different opinion on Chinese investment in Arctic minerals, Arctic mining projects? There are still some significant projects in Nunavut, for example, that have Chinese commercial interest there. It's not as explicit and direct as the Shandong proposal, but they do have some carried interest. As an example, and of course I'm sure, and I don't know if even China's interested in the Canadian Arctic after its experience with Shandong, but I'd like to have the perspective of the panelists on this. Thank you.
Great, fantastic, thank you, Patrick. And I'll also note that we have a lot of expertise in the room on this. I don't want to make our colleagues who are not necessarily speaking on behalf of Canada or Canadian government to address that particular point, Patrick, which I think is a live issue. But there's a lot of opinion in the room, and we can discuss that. Michael, over here. Yep. In the front.
Thanks. Paul Meyer from Simon Fraser University. I commend all the panelists for their insights. I would caution, I don't think we should be in a hurry to bury the rules-based international order just because we've had a spike in violations recently, any more than we would throw out the criminal law if we had a spike of criminality in the country. And indeed, just now, there's been a new multilateral treaty that has been concluded, known as the High Seas Treaty. It's formally, I think, the protection of biological diversity beyond national jurisdictions. And I'd be curious, maybe from our Japanese and Korean colleagues, how they would evaluate this, because it addresses some of the problems that have already been noted in the conversation, like overfishing or illegal fishing. So I would be curious to hear your views.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. I think they're not completely getting rid of rules-based order. I think the language is diminished, right? So there's a lot of language with China. It's not a rapprochement, it's recalibration or calibrated or strategic partnerships with guardrails. I think we now need multiple words to be able to describe things because you can't just find one word. So it's the diminishing, I think, is what the Prime Minister said, in fairness. But point well taken. Should we do one more round? Yes, please. Side there.
Thank you. My name is Colin Laughlin. I'm a journalist with a magazine called Maritime Magazine, so I'm going to ask a maritime question. It really picks up on the professor from Simon Fraser's question. You talked about the illegal fishing activities and need for collaboration in terms of monitoring, specifically with more satellite surveillance. In the context of the diminishing world order or diminishing rules-based, what enforcement mechanisms are in place when you do get involved with illegal and unreported fishing activities in that area? I mean, to observe it is one thing, to enforce it is another. So how do you see the enforcement playing out?
Great. I think we now have a good, solid base of questions, which sort of maybe we'll start, Liz, with you on the China stuff, both in terms of acceptance of China's more active role there in this whole concept of being a near state, as well as the critical mineral conversation, which everybody can address. And then we have a whole set of questions around multilateral cooperation, especially on issues like fisheries and others in the current context of this heated geopolitical discussions. So, Liz.
Okay, thank you for these questions. I think no one likes China's term near Arctic state. Even Russia has objected to it. And because China, of course, geographically is not adjacent to the Arctic. It makes some claims based on the impact of climate from Arctic-related climate issues and other geographical features in terms of a river that flows north through Russia to the Arctic. And so there's an effort to justify this terminology. But even in the Chinese Arctic community, this was controversial. But ultimately, the Chinese government went with it. If you look at Russia-China relations in the Arctic, Putin himself doesn't like to use the term Polar Silk Road, which is the Chinese term for the shipping route from northeast China through the Northern Sea route to Europe. And that's because Russia becomes a through space for China's shipping ambitions. And so Russia always uses the Northern Sea route terminology. So you have still some differences on how other states see China's role. I mean, what China has done in the past decade is achieve a certain number of technological breakthroughs that enable it to be a credible scientific player in the Arctic with its undersea technologies and space technologies that enable Russia even to use its own Arctic. But that technology is all dual use, which also elicits concerns by many Arctic states. So I think China has not really succeeded. Partly this has to do with its wolf warrior diplomats that overplayed their hands in the Arctic region, making demands about the use of Huawei in the Faroe Islands, for example, and thinking that the prospect of Chinese investment would be so appealing that everyone would welcome them. But I think there has been some appreciation of Chinese investment, especially in the northernmost communities in the Arctic, where investment is severely lacking. But in below the Arctic Circle, in the capitals, there's been a lot more caution, especially since the war in Ukraine. And that really, I think, made it much more difficult for China to act in the Arctic as well as in Europe. The critical minerals issue, I think, is partly in the Arctic, but partly separate. It has to do with the weaponization of trade and what would happen to critical mineral supply chains in the event of a Taiwan contingency. That's what keeps U.S. military planners up at night. That defense industries would not be able to get the critical minerals they need for a protracted conflict with China. And so, of course, the U.S. is a player in the weaponization of trade, but the issue of critical minerals goes beyond the Arctic, although many of them are located in the Arctic. And if you look at Russia and China again, Russia has a lot of critical minerals, but can't develop them on its own. And China's not sharing that technology with Russia either. So you have sovereignty concerns that emerge even among very close partners. And so I don't know that, I'm not an expert on Canadian foreign policy, but I don't know that a recalibration is going to change the views about critical mineral supply chains, because it has to do with issues beyond bilateral relations. It has to do with global supply chains. And a lot of countries are very concerned about how they can maintain sovereignty over their resources, but also develop them in a sustainable way. And I'm not sure we found the answer to that question yet.
That is a fantastic point, Liz, in terms of understanding the limits, especially when it comes to technology transfers, because China's chokehold really is around the processing and refining. And that is an issue that would not be addressed through potential rapprochement. So that, Patrick, to your question, we can come back to it, but I think it's going to be something to watch in terms of what would happen. Do you want to just immediately? Yeah, sure. Right. Yeah.
And some of these other projects, well, they may be categorized as critical, but they're also common and they're available. Right. If we're talking about something like zinc, well, it's different than antimony or gallium or something that's very unique. So it could be
absolutely.
Yeah,
no,
so it's
I
just
think
larger investment question as opposed to something that truly is a strategic concern. I just want to be.
I think that is the direction of travel. That they're now going to be a lot more case-by-case application of understanding sort of what actually needs to be protected and what potentially could be open, because there is also now a huge pressure to attract investment, right? So, and it is something that all of us who are paying attention to this file would need to watch to see how particularly investment from China is now going to be treated, in which sectors it's going to be greenlit, and in which sectors it's still going to be sort of the yellow caution, and in which sectors will truly remain red in terms of not inviting that. And I think that is a conversation that needs to happen among policymakers, but also others who are paying attention. And there is a change, because I think there was a much stricter application of that security lens, let's say between 2021 and now. I think you will see a change, but to what extent, that's really the question to be debated. And I think the point that Liz and I'm hoping Jennifer and others will be making is also bringing lessons from others and how this has been unfolding in other jurisdictions, certainly lessons from Europe, which is also struggling with this. The kind of, we all need investment and we all need technology cooperation, and China has a lot to offer on both, but there are also then some security and sovereignty question marks that need to be protected and discussed. And that's the kind of the small yard, high fences was a really nice formulation of the former national security advisor from Washington under Biden, Jake Sullivan. But I think the trouble is the yard can get expanded and the fences are not high enough, right? Or they're not coordinated. And then the issue becomes, how do powers coordinate among themselves rather than just try to individually build high fences and protect their own little small yard, right? So these are active conversations for which I think there's not one answer, but please.
Hello. There we go. I just wanted to add to this question of the legitimacy of China. I think one of the things that we need to remember is the terminology of a near Arctic state was actually released by China in 2018. This is not something that happened last year, and yet a lot of the rhetoric we hear right now makes it sound like it came out last year. So it's actually what we have seen in terms of, and also the Polar Silk Road, we've seen seen actually that China is actually reversing a lot of those activities. They're not investing in it because of the policy the reactions by Arctic states, who initially were very open to Chinese business and have very much reversed that, whether that be Canada, whether that be Norway, Finland. All of these countries are actually the ones that are taking a different policy position in terms of investment from China. And so you do see China doubling down, one, on its relationship with Russia, but also really doubling down in terms of its science contributions to the Arctic. And it's us that are continuing to use this terminology of near Arctic state and polar Silk Road, whereas China itself has actually reduced its use of that terminology, but because it seems to be a perfect catch to really get people's attention, this is something that you hear a lot in the news that they're talking about, and ironically, it's us that's perpetuating it. So I think that that's something to really keep in mind. In terms of the critical minerals piece, the other thing I would add to this piece of the conversation is the economic viability question. And again, this comes back to the economics of accessing these resources in the Arctic context. It's extremely expensive to do work in the Arctic, and so the economic viability is frankly not there in most cases. And what we need to then ask the question is, it's about strategic importance, and then that requires public investment. So it's not just a private sector thing, and that would be the case in Greenland. A lot of the stuff that, or a lot of the minerals that we're focusing on, and the fact that there's a large quantity of these types of minerals does not make them a business opportunity in a lot of cases, not in any time in our lifetime, from my perspective. So again, this becomes about a supply chain factor, and then it's about public investment that we need to be thinking about. So I think, and I mean, in terms of the Canada-China piece of it, I think there's still going to be a huge, I mean, there's a lot of sensitivities around the development of this relationship, and I think things like supply chains around sensitive materials will continue to be a factor, but I think this is definitely an evolving situation.
Thank you so much. Dr. Natsuko, maybe if I could come back to you on the question from Professor Meyer on the maritime cooperation, and certainly Japan is still very interested in UNCLOS and international law and in its overall oceans policy in the Arctic as well. So maybe if you could speak how that's evolving, what's the situation there, that would be great.
Right. Yeah, thank you for the question. And I'm afraid I'm a right person to make a comment, but basically the Japanese government or Japanese other private sectors are really sincere to follow the international governance, including not only the BBNJ but also other fishery agreement as well. And also regarding the IUU fisheries, it also occurs in the Japanese EEZ area, not only Japanese domestic fishing boat, but also other like North Korea and China's fishing boat are coming into our waters to doing the illegal fisheries. And we are detecting those fishing boats as well, but the infrastructure for the Coast Guard is not enough to take all of them. So some of them are caught by our Coast Guard, but most of them are maybe we can't catch those illegal activities. However, if we can make strong evidence this boat of your countries is doing illegal fishing in our waters, then we can put those strong evidence to those countries. So please rule those fishing boat to commit the illegal activities. So this could be discussed also in the high seas as well. There's no infrastructures to rule those activities physically, but the international community, if international community detects those activities and gets strong evidence, this boat is your country's, then the international community can make those countries to rule and those rules of the committing such kind of illegal activities. That is my personal comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kang, can I bring you into this question or anything else that you would want to weigh in on the discussion? I know we've talked about many things.
You know, what happens in the Arctic in Korea is everybody recognizes this. It is closely related with, East Asia, Korean Peninsula, climate change, everything. So also the people thinking global warming is an opportunity, but also acknowledging its risk. So that's why the science is very important before we go ahead. So, but I think is personally to mitigate this geopolitical tension, especially Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, is very important. So it started 2021, but now is implementing the plans. At least 16 years. We need to have long-term observation before we go fishery in the Central Arctic Ocean. So this is very important agreement. Even Russia, everybody, Arctic countries and non-Arctic country agreed. We have to follow this rule. Also, I think historically the International Polar Year is very important. It's about 6 years later, it's 150 years in polar IPY. So every polar country now preparing this IPY. Also Korea is preparing. So IPY is also functioned very well during geopolitical tension in a long time ago. Is Antarctic Treaty make Antarctica as a peaceful place. Also, I think IPY and CALFA, we can use this agreement to mitigate the tension in this. So I think this is my personal opinion to do it.
Can you say a little bit more about the International Polar Year and sort of how you are making sense of it in the current climate? Because
now the SCAR, Antarctic and IASC in Arctic, the society scientists are now talking about the planning, how to work together, sharing data together. So each country, they're preparing how to work together at least in the Central Arctic Ocean. So this is a very important process now doing.
So I think it's to the point that was made by Paul that there are still pockets of cooperation at the most sort of universal level, and I think some of those will exist, and hopefully some elements of science will be that. Other questions or comments? Again, please don't limit yourself to questions. We welcome a lot of other comments as well. Yes, young lady here.
Thank you so much. My name is Kaylin from UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And as we kind of discuss this more pragmatic and working level approach to cooperation in the Arctic, especially among Arctic states, and even the shift in kind of operations within the Arctic Council, what avenues or platforms can we see for Indigenous organizations and communities to continue to engage in Arctic governance in these times?
That's a question. Thank you. We always welcome UBC students at APFC events, so thank you. Half of our team are graduates of UBC, so welcome. Pittman, yeah. Mike is coming.
I'm Pittman Potter, Professor Emeritus from UBC, focused on China primarily over the last number of years. But the question I have actually, and I would just echo the point that was made earlier without being too duplicative, and that is that I think the rumors of the death of the rules-based international order are a bit premature. We have a rogue actor who is denying the role of international law, but that doesn't mean the system is crashing. And in fact, the reason the system exists is because it's the mutual interest of most of the countries in the world to have that system. And most of the countries in the world are not superpowers. Most of them are medium powers or less, and they need international law. So I would just say that it is existing because of that interest. I would also say that those who seem to be operating outside of that system, so if we just take three kind of autocratic or autocratic wannabe states, they are very different. I mean, Xi Jinping's approach to the international order is not to get rid of it, but to change it so it suits China's interests, which has been the dynamic of the rules-based international order since 1945. So I think that, and that's very different from what we're hearing out of Washington, D.C., which is to get rid of the order.
Putin's kind of in the middle, but I think that that's the first point. Second point is
scary thought of Putin in this.
Well, I think the facts support that. But the other thing is
No,
that
I don't disagree. I just think
it's interesting. Yeah, well, that's true. The other thing is that autocratic states do not get along with each other. Autocratic states are used to having bilateral relations that they can bully their opponents, and when they're up against each other, they basically don't get along. So, as with China-Russia cooperation in decades past, as in U.S.-China cooperation of decades past, and even, dare I say, Canada-China cooperation and then these things change as the material conditions of international trade, investment, and resources and climate change. So I would think that what we're seeing is a change in the rules-based system, which is going to put more interest and capacity and capability in medium-sized countries, which is sort of what Carney's talking about. It's sort of an echo of the non-aligned movement from back in Cold War days, and that would not be a bad thing. So I think we just need to, instead of saying, well, it's all rules-based international order or it's going away, we should look at what these transitional steps are going to be, and that affects the Arctic. Last point is, the Arctic affects the entire planet. So the idea of China's claim to being near Arctic when they're not really near the Arctic, well, I scoff at that as well as other people do, but the fact is that people in Brazil are affected by the Arctic. People in Latin America, people in South Asia are affected by what happens in the Arctic. So in a way, the global commons has an interest in Arctic policy, and that can be a generator of cooperation and institutional change. Thank you.
Fantastic. I see a couple of more. So yeah, colleague from Philippines, Consul General.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Consul General of the Philippines here in Vancouver, Gina Hamuralin. My question, I know that the Arctic region is partly a global common, but not also total, because the permanent members, they share exclusive economic zone within the Arctic region. So, but there is a part of the high seas that is still under part of UNCLOS. So I hope it's getting to be the next playground or battleground for economic risk. But what about the small countries who are neither observer states or permanent members of the Arctic Council, who are energy deficient or have no resources, mineral resources in the future? Are there discussions on the future sharing of resources in the area where it is a global common for the small states, like, in the Asia, as what the previous speaker said? So I know the countries are preserving it for future generation, but there'll come a time that there'll be some exploitation of resources like critical minerals. So how do the small countries figure in this economic governance in the near future?
Great, thank you. Lots of questions around governance of the Arctic, which we'll unpack. Anything else? Because I'll just take final questions. Okay, so let's get all of them in, and then we'll give our panelists an opportunity to respond. So I see a question in the back, and then one here. So.
I'm Harvey. I'm a Simon Fraser University student, and my question would be pertaining primarily towards, of course, what's going on with the tweets of US President Donald J. Trump and the concerns it might have when it comes to cooperation with the likes of Canada, especially in the north. So I was lucky enough to participate in an actual simulation event about cooperation that would include the likes of Japan, South Korea, but also the United States on issues pertaining to security in the north, especially when it comes to infrastructure. But considering we're seeing repeated tweets about concerns about annexation, jokes about the 51st states, which at this point are less becoming jokes and more of an actual concern, could we see that actually affecting when it comes to the actual policy or the actual people on the ground in the likes of places like be it in the Security Council, the UN bodies, but also, of course, in the Arctic Council? And could we see a change in even the way that the US approaches at that level when it comes to cooperating with Canada, be it for everything like search and rescue or even just general cooperation? Thank you.
And thank you also for reminding us that as part of this project, we've also been working with SFU and working with SFU students for these simulations. So thank you for participating in those discussions. That'll be all part of the report and the work that the APFC is doing on this topic. So welcome and thank you. And the final question from lady over here.
Hello, my name is Jordan Owens. I'm from Summa Strategies. I had a question about the Canadian government's increased talk about bridging the infrastructure gap in Northern Canada, particularly as they, throw around the phrase dual-use infrastructure. I was wondering if you could talk more about how you see that going and what needs you think might be there, and maybe some examples if there have been times in other countries where they've made this sorts of effort and how that has succeeded or what lessons have been learned. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much. So I think we have a number of questions, maybe on the dual use and infrastructure. If I could come to you on the Japan's experience, if there's anything that you could share on the shipbuilding, but then also on all the governance questions. So if you don't mind, we'll start with you. No pressure. No pressure.
Okay, thank you. So regarding the infrastructure, maybe shipbuilding fields, Japan has been studying together with Canadian Research Institute to examine the ice and ship interaction. Then we develop our technology to build the icebreakers as well. So the cooperation has been continued many years, long years. And at this moment, Japan has several icebreakers. Maybe 2 are for passenger ship, and 1 is for the Antarctic research. And now 1 is constructing for the Arctic research icebreaker. And she will be launched next year. And before then, many Arctic researchers are on board Canadian icebreakers like Louis and Laurent, like that. And so we have been cooperating many years to research the Arctic and the shipbuilding in the ice-infested waters. And Canada has developed very sophisticated the navigation support system, and this system becomes the base of the Arctic IMO's polar code, Polaris. The Canadian system becomes the base of that. So Canada has been Canada has long experience about the ship icebreaker building as well, and icebreaker navigation as well, and ice pilot as well. So Japan has been learning from those navigation technology from Canada as well. So we can develop in cooperation together further. And I'm afraid, is this a comment or answer for your question?
No, it's fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we'll use this as a sort of opportunity also for any final thoughts and remarks from our panelists. So, Jennifer, maybe I'll start with you, and then we'll go in that order. Lots of questions about governance. So, and I know that's your area. So, see what you can do with them in the short time we have.
Great, thank you. I will start with the Indigenous involvement question. I think it's an important one and not something we've covered a lot during these conversations, so thank you for that question. I actually think this is, as we look at sort of how traditional science diplomacy or diplomacy is challenged, I actually think this is a really important time for Indigenous peoples in the Arctic to have a leadership role. They have a lot more flexibility, and we've started to use the term Indigenous diplomacy in the Arctic context. Our Arctic Indigenous peoples have been leaders in diplomacy, and we've seen that through the unique role they play in the Arctic Council, but that has expanded into other institutions in the Arctic and in the UN system. And what's interesting to me is with the pause of the Arctic Council, we did see that, in fact, the flexibility that these permanent participant organizations had allowed them to advance issues and to be conveners in many of these policy issues in a way that states could not. And we saw the flexibility of the institutions to enable that. So I think there's a lot more. I think this is going to be an interesting area to follow, and I think there's a huge potential here for states who recognize and value the role of Indigenous peoples to continue to lift those positions up and to enable them to be leaders in defining what the policy priorities are. So I think that's a really important point. I could speak to all. I'm gonna in terms of the Arctic Ocean and the role. So the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, which we've heard talked about, is unique in the sense it's one of a kind in terms of using the precautionary principle. So it's an agreement, an international agreement that allows for states to come together when there is no fishery. And I think what's important to remember here is that we don't actually know at this point, and that's the whole point, is to make the decision to not have fisheries until there is sufficient information, as we've heard. And that's a really important and defining moment. And we don't, and also what's interesting about the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement is it also has Indigenous representation. So in terms of decision making around that, it is an international agreement, and it's not constrained to particular actors. I think that those countries that have fisheries and express an interest have an opportunity to explore how to engage in that agreement. And so this doesn't need to be exclusive, but it will, I think it is about defining responsible fisheries and having the right resources to do that. Do you want me to?
Please, no, you can answer, I think, even briefly some of
Okay. And then, I mean, the political hot potato of Trump's comments, I think ultimately there are multiple layers of things going on here. I do believe, and I see the cooperation continuing in the Arctic. I believe that it will on a constructive level, at a working level. That's what's happening now. And the more that we can separate the politics and the rhetoric at the higher levels from the work that needs to be done to support the work of the needs and interests of people in the Arctic context, the stronger that will continue. When those things become politicized, the harder it's going to be to have constructive and pragmatic cooperation. And that's what I see people trying to do right now, is as much as possible try to separate the politics, or the high-level politics, from what really, recognizing that there's still work to be done and there's still important things that need to happen. And so how do we continue to advance really important policy issues? With stating climate change, I mean, the number of times I've heard people say, well, we'll have to come back to climate change later, is shocking, and should be a concern to all of us. This is not going away, and it's only going to get worse, and so we need people on the ground continuing to advance these issues.
Absolutely. I think the situation is not getting simpler, I think, as Dr. Kang said. So maybe I'll come to you, and then we'll finish with Liz, please.
I think, as she mentioned, high sea issue is very important for us. Also, the Arctic Ocean is very important, high sea, but different situation. The Arctic Ocean is very dangerous. Actually, it's modeler and AI, and they can predict, but in the field, it's very suddenly change. It's very dangerous. So you need to have real data. Even, the shipbuilding and shipping company. It's very search and rescue issue, and the insurance is very expensive to using the Arctic shipping route. So in my personal opinion, everybody here, they invest in stocks, so they see the fear and greed and neutral everybody, they using that as a gauge. But so we need to develop some kind of risk index in the something like that. So I think we need to, normal people need to more. So that's why, as a scientist, we need to share together the data first. I think it's my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you, and we're very grateful that you're engaging with us lay people. We do need scientists in this conversation, and we need you to speak to us in a way that we can understand, and for policymakers to make informed, data-driven, evidence-driven decisions. I think, so thank you for being here and for engaging. Liz, you're fine.
I'd like to follow on that. I think there's a role for normal people in upholding the world's rules-based order. And I think our politicians make a lot of noise, but there are plenty of actors, including in the United States, who are advocating for cooperation in the Arctic, scientific collaboration, indigenous communities, and so on. So I think that we have to get beyond this level, as Vina said. Even in terms of U.S.-Canada cooperation, I mean, I think this terrible moment could be an opportunity to look at the security of Greenland, and there are areas where we could improve things. For example, NORAD could invest in an improved radar for Greenland that would deal with the actual threat, which is hypersonic missiles, not Russian and Chinese vessels circling the territory. And so this could open a new conversation once cooler heads prevail, which I do hope they will. In terms of China and governance, I think China has used many terms in referring to the Arctic. One favorite of Xi Jinping's is a community of common destiny. That doesn't improve things much from the near Arctic state because it implies China could be the leader of this community. In my reading, I still have seen many articles about the Polar Silk Road as a trade route. But I think for China, there's a frustration with the Arctic because Russia remains the gatekeeper for China's ambitions. And until the Central Arctic Ocean is navigable, that's going to be the case. And China has to comply within those strictures. And so that is a motivation for engaging more with Russia. In Antarctic, it's a different story where China's a treaty signatory and has been working with Russia to perhaps impede some of the environmental protection efforts in that space. And so I think China is trying to also use technologies to be able to act more independently in polar spaces, undersea and in space, that would not require the say-so of other actors. And so China's taking a multi-dimensional approach to this issue of governance, which we will need to keep monitoring in the future.
Thank you. Dr. Notsukis, yeah, please.
So briefly, I'd like to introduce one examples of the cooperative activities. So last year, Canadian Coast Guard ship Sir Wilfrid Laurier visited Japan. Yeah. This was the second time for her to come to Japan. The objective is to carry out the cooperative patrol drills against the IUU fishery together with Japan, United States, and Korean Coast Guard. So 4 countries together with carry out the drills against the IUU fishery patrol.
No, thank you so much for raising that. I think it would be important to say that in the last few years, as part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, we've seen a lot more engagement from Canadian Navy and other parts of the government as well in partnering with Japan and with Korea. So as we're reimagining various parts of our foreign policy, certainly from the perspective of this foundation, we want to keep all of those practical cooperations that have been ongoing through the Indo-Pacific strategy's various elements. And certainly the example that you gave is one of them, but there are many others that I know colleagues in the room can also share. So I'm not going to try to summarize this discussion. It has been a hour and a half and following a full day of discussions, but I do want to profoundly thank our panelists for engaging with very complicated questions, for bringing so much nuance into the discussions, for sharing their expertise. It's important for us to have these kinds of interdisciplinary discussions where we bring engineers and scientists and economists and political scientists together, when we have a room full of students and professionals and diplomats to really try to wrestle with the hot topics of the day while recognizing the rhetoric that's there, but also seeing the reality and what is possible. From our perspective, we certainly are committed to having these kinds of conversations, to not only looking at Canada's engagement with the Indo-Pacific and Asia, but also making those necessary bridges between what we're doing in one theater with what's happening in Canada's Arctic as well as Euro-Atlantic, because I feel like dividing it into these neat silos is no longer fit for purpose. We do have to have an overarching approach, and one that is pragmatically seeing the world as it is, and it's changing, as our Prime Minister says, but also that doesn't fully abandon the rules-based order that has served Canada. I think we have to be frank about that truth as well, that it has really benefited us, and that countries like Canada and Japan and Korea, we need to continue to find ways of preserving as much of it as possible, and also still building new mechanisms. I think the reality is we also live in a world in which we need now new networked coalitions that are building on things rather than completely removing things. So one other thing that caught my attention from that we're no longer talking about sort of the United Nations and post-World War II order was built on the ashes of World War II. So I hope that we don't get to that point where now rebuilding from the ashes, but rather can build with the parts of the system that are still working. So it is fragmenting, it is diminishing, it is under pressure, but there are still some elements of it that are not yet burned down. So let's try to preserve them and build up from there. So that is my glass half full attempt. That's what passes for optimism and hopefulness right now. So at least we haven't burned it down completely, and let's try to avoid that. So again, huge thank you for all of you to being here. Huge thank you to the Asia Pacific Foundation team for organizing all of this. You guys have done a tremendous job, and please stay engaged. Join our conversations as they happen, and sign up to the Asia Watch, which you can get every week about all of these events. Again, thank you so much for being here. Have a good day.